This podcast is sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Welcome to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Today, we are interviewing Ken Livingstone.
Tom?
I'm sitting.
Okay, I'll move this room. If ever this does get shown anywhere, do send me an email so I can get it up.
Of course, definitely. And it's not, I'm very much going to be looking at it from your point of view, to get a story.
Do whatever you want.
Not impose
I have no problem.
ideologies and stuff.
You could spend the entire time being rude and abusive. I'm used to it.
Okay.
What are your family origins? Well, what always amazes me, being accused of being anti-Semitic, my grandma was a Jewish refugee from Eastern Europe. The first woman I asked to marry me is Jewish. And in the 8 years I was mayor, anti-Semitic incidents recorded by London police went down by half. Then in Boris's 8 years, they doubled. Not because he's anti-Semitic, he just wasn't doing the fucking job.
Yes.
I was out there promoting tolerance, not just for Jews, but women, Asians, blacks. All hate crime went down in my 8 years. But none of this is ever reported in the Tory media. How old are you? God, I was your age in 1992.
Okay. Well, I think...
But then, see, when I was born, the average life was just 63 in Britain. On my first day at work in 1962, the HR guy said, "You retire at 65, you'll be dead at 68. Now the average life is 80. It's amazing how... It's all down to that post-war Labour government creating the NHS and the welfare state.
Apparently you were into Love.
Pardon?
Love. The group Love.
I don't remember it. My memory has gone. This last year, my memory's just gone.
Right.
And I got this 94-year-old friend who's still got a perfect memory. I'm so bloody envious.
I see.
Don't forget, while you interview me, you've got to talk loud, otherwise I won't hear.
I will talk loud, yes.
I used to have perfect hearing. This last year, it's just got worse. But then I'm 78, you can't be surprised.
You look good for 78.
Pardon?
You look good for 78. I could say 10 years younger.
If I think back to the 50s or 60s, someone my age was a senile staggering around on crutches. Now, my brain's fine and the memory's crap, but I could still be running the mayor's office. That's just amazing. How the world's changed in my life. All down to the Labour government creating the NHS.
Right, yes.
This is the first time I've done an interview and not been paid for it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But it's always a company.
If I had Netflix on board or someone, we'd be, that might be possible. But I'm just an independent. However, I hope that this interview will be...
You've got to talk louder.
I hope this interview will be a, something that people will be able to relate to. Yeah, I think that's the number one key thing I want to, as a human, but also as a great talent. Okay.
Look at the camera or you?
I definitely look at the camera. Yeah, this is like
Okay.
sort of quite an intimate moment. So I'm going to get a bit closer, get a good angle. Okay, so can you tell us your name, please?
I'm Kenneth Robert Livingstone, born a month after the end of the Second World War.
Can you tell us a bit about your first memories?
Well, I just came from a working class family in South London. Dad was a window cleaner. I was born in a tiny little 2-bedroom flat, didn't have a bathroom, outside toilet, and that was the poverty in Britain just after the end of the Second World War. But in that next 28 years, every year everything got better. Every one of my mates, we all left school, we all got a job. If you couldn't afford to buy your own home, you'd be able to get a rent a council flat and so on. And then, of course, 1973, Saudi Arabia quadruples the price of oil. ends 3 decades of global economic growth, and the world is transformed.
In what way do you think it's transformed?
You've got to speak louder.
In what way has the world transformed since 73?
Well, that was that first 28 years of war. Every year, everything got better in Britain. I'm so worried about what it's going to be like for my kids in 20 years. This government isn't building the council homes we need for people to live in. The welfare state's been reduced in size. Spending on the NHS is down 10%. I'm waiting a year for an operation on the arthritis in my knee. Everything is getting worse. So I'm now genuinely worried. What is this world going to be like for my kids in 20 years?
I'd like to ask a bit more about your childhood. Going back to Britain, when you were born, when you were growing up, do you remember your parents?
Oh, I was really lucky. I had a wonderful mum and dad. In all my childhood, never once were me or my sister hit. If we were naughty, we were sent to our bedroom, not spanked or anything like that. But literally, we were also very lucky because they involved us. We didn't have mass television in those days. Twice a week, mum and dad would take us to the cinema. We'd see a nice film. And then on the way home, we'd eat a bag of chips. Because in those days, you didn't see a Chinese or an Indian restaurant. It was all fish and chip shops all along the street. It was a completely different world. It was only when I was 22, mum and dad said, a Chinese restaurant's open. Do you want to come?
Where were you brought up? Where exactly?
Well, I was brought up south of London in Lambeth. I was born in Streatham. Then we moved to Tulse Estate. London County Council built this big estate there. Then mum and dad moved a couple of miles away. They bought their own little 4-bedroom house in West Norwood. So it's all that south bit of Lambeth. That was the first 30 years of my life.
Do you remember the kind of values you were brought up with?
Well, the values in those days were, very good. The murder rate in London then was a quarter what it is today. Violence was minimal compared with now. You didn't worry about one of your friends being stabbed to death on their way home at night or anything like that. And as I said, people were happy. Every kid left school, got a job, got married. Now there's so much anger and the growth of crime has got dramatically worse. And as I say, I really worry what it's going to be like for my kids in 20 years.
The demographics have changed. I think there were many changes. Britain was no longer the superpower. There was decolonialism. Migration flows have increased since. London has increased in population. But what's your take on that?
Well, if I look back, when I was born, London was just an exclusively white city. It was only when I was 3 years old, my grandmother said, look across the road, there's a black man. We'd never seen one before. And that was the Windrush generation. Now, of course, we're the most diverse city in the world. Only 47% of Londoners are of English white origin. And I look about all my 5 kids, they've never dated a white English person. It's always been some Asian or black origin and so on. I just can't believe how this city has changed in my lifetime. But it's got better and I love it.
What do you love about it?
I think this is the most diverse city in the world. And coming with that, what I really do enjoy, we've got the most wonderful range of restaurants. I can take you to a Tibetan restaurant after the end of this interview. That was inconceivable in my youth. It was only when I was 22, mum and dad said a Chinese restaurant's open. We'd never seen one. And that year I was born at the end of the war, in the whole of Britain, there were only 4 Indian restaurants. Now you just look at our city, it's amazing.
What your parents, what political affiliation were they? Did they vote? Did your parents vote?
Pardon?
Did your parents vote?
Vote?
Your parents, did they vote?
Oh yeah, I don't know. 85% of people voted at general election. But the interesting thing is, although I came from an ordinary working class background, everyone in my family had always voted Conservative. I was the first person ever to vote Labour. But that was the situation. A third of the working class voted Conservative in those days.
Why?
No, because I suppose a big factor, we had defeated the Nazis in World War II. And our leader, of course, was Winston Churchill, the leader of the Tory party. And we all grew up, we revered him. You know, he had defeated the greatest evil in human history, a monster who had murdered 6 million Jews. And without that victory, this world would be a nightmare place to be living in today.
I understand that your grandmother was Jewish, is that correct?
Well, she never mentioned it, but it was revealed when I was mayor that she'd been a Jewish refugee from Eastern Europe. But arriving here as Jewish, that was then the main form of racism. And she dumped her Jewish background, integrated herself into the Church of England, married an English Church of England man, and never told us that she had Jewish origins. It was only after she died and we were clearing out her flat, we found all these old papers indicating she'd been a Jewish refugee.
Okay. And back in the day, you went to school, and what was the curriculum like back then? Did you make friends as well? Were you when you went to school in your youth? What were you taught? Were you a hard worker? Were you an academic? Did you make friends?
Well,
what was your life like at school?
when I was born, only 3% of children went to university. You left school at 15, you got a job. And so you were just taught English, maths, geography, history, art, and there were really good visits to the local swimming pool, and we had a good local gym and so on. So we had good activity. It was a very good school. I was lucky. It had only just been built, 8 stories high, 2,000 boys. I think it must have been the biggest school in London.
2,000 boys. Were there no girls?
Back in those days, I can't ever recall a mixed school. Girls went to one school, boys went to another.
Wow. What did you want to become when you were young? Did you have ambitions?
Well, just with a working class background and failing me 11 plus, then dropping out of school, my daydream, I would have loved to have been an astronaut, because that was dominating our news in those days. Russians had just launched their first satellite and so on. But the job I applied for, which I really wanted, was at London Zoo. Of course, I had no interest in politics. I was obsessed with animals. My childhood hero had been David Attenborough. But sadly, the zoo didn't have any vacancies. Because if I got a job at the zoo, I most likely would never have got into politics. I'd have just been at that zoo all the time, totally caught up in it. Even growing up as a child, I went to the zoo about once a month. I just loved wandering around it, even in the middle of winter when there was almost nobody else there.
What was it about the zoo that attracted you?
I just loved animals, natural history and astronomy. As I say, I had no interest in politics in those years. But as I also just said, my childhood hero was David Attenborough. And every week I watched his natural history programme and just daydreamed, could I be another David Attenborough?
What happened next? What was your first job?
Well, having failed to get enough O-levels to go into the sixth form, I had to leave school. And I wanted a job at London Zoo. They didn't have any vacancies. But then I got a job as an apprentice animal technician at a lung cancer research unit attached to the Royal Marsden Hospital in Fulham Road. So suddenly I'm working with these brilliant surgeons and doctors that really had an impact on my life, my thought and approach to things.
What happened next?
Well, I was there for 8 years, and then in 1969 I decided to join the Labour Party. Now that was the end of Wilson's first government. He'd become deeply unpopular. A third of all the Labour Party members had resigned from the party. And I remember at my first meeting, the chairman of the Norwood Labour Party said, "You're our first new member we've had all year." And 2 years later, I'm on the local council. 2 years after that, I'm on the Greater London Council. And then 2 years later, I'm Labour's candidate in the key Tory marginal of Hampstead for the 1979 parliamentary election. So joining as most others were quitting, I got promoted very quickly.
How come?
Pardon?
How come? Why were you promoted so quickly? Were you deeply involved?
Well, I was very lucky because I threw myself into it. Within 2 months of joining, I was chair of the local Young Socialists. I was helping our Labour Party agent, a wonderful guy, Eddie Lopez, who, because it was a key Labour marginal, and we really had to fight to make sure we didn't lose the election then in 1970. But we did only hang on by about 600 votes.
Now, how did that work back in those days? What were you promoting, and how would you connect with voters?
Well, the main thing was you toured the whole constituency, you knocked on doors, you asked people how they were voting. If they weren't voting Labour, you tried to persuade them. You'd give them a nice leaflet setting out the policies of our local MP and things like that. It was very much one-to-one meetings with all the voters. Now it's all done over the telly
Would you
and
say
the media.
Would you say it was more intimate back then?
Oh, I think it really was. It's a much more trusting, cooperative world. Now there's so many people just living alone in a little flat, and many of them doing abuse over their computer on the internet. There was nothing like that in the world I grew up in.
And what were the challenges of the local constituency back then?
Well, it was a key. It had been Tory for years, had just narrowly gone Labour, but we did have a brilliant Labour MP who worked very hard, built up support, so we hung on to it. We've never lost it since. Now it's a comfortably Labour seat, and I think it was the first constituency in Britain ever to have a black woman MP.
And which constituency is that?
This is Norwood in Lambeth, South Lambeth.
Do you know what people want? Back then, did you have a sort of, did you know what voters wanted? You know, did you know that they wanted to improve their lives or the economic situation, healthcare, maybe helping the poor? Did you know, did you have an instinct? Were you a people person, would you say?
Well, the easy thing is that the 1945 Labour government created the welfare state, the NHS, built council housing. Every year everything got better. And then when the Tories got in, Churchill came back to power in 51, he carried on with all those policies. Of course, it was only when Thatcher got in she stopped doing all of that. But so that was the world I grew up in. Whether you had a Labour or a Tory government, they made life better for people, not just the rich, but ordinary working class people as well. And you can't say that about the sort of Tory governments we have now.
So what was your driving ambition to work in politics?
I had no ambition to work in politics. I just, as I say, my ambition was to work with animals at London Zoo.
Right.
But then in the 1960s, I got, interested in politics because Kennedy was elected president. In the 1960s, in 1960 I was 15 when Kennedy was elected president. Till then I'd had no interest in politics. But here's this charismatic young man. Until then, presidents and prime ministers have been white-haired old men who were boring. And then here in Britain we had Harold Wilson. And so through the 60s I suddenly was watching politics on the telly every time, and all about the war in Vietnam, of course. And so by the end of that decade, in 69, I decided I'd join the Labour Party and work to make life better for people.
Has John F. Kennedy had an influence on you? What do you remember?
Kennedy had a massive influence on many, and I think all around the world, because until then, President and Prime Minister were just white-haired, quite boring old men. Here's this charismatic young man. And still today, I get up old documentaries about him and his brother Bobby Kennedy and watch them. Totally great. Just takes me back to my youth.
What do you remember? Do you remember any of his speeches or?
All his speeches were good. And the tragedy is, if he hadn't been assassinated in 1963, he'd decided that following his election the following year in '64, he was going to pull America out of the war in Vietnam. And of course, the new President Johnson carried on with it throughout his whole term. 6 million Vietnamese lost their lives.
Have you ever been to America?
Pardon?
Have you ever been to America?
I've not just been to America, I've been all around the world. I mean, when I became the Mayor of London, I was being flown everywhere. I mean, mayors and governments all around the world wanted to talk to me about the congestion charge.
What did they say? Do you remember?
Well, they were interested because it was only in 1970 Singapore brought in a congestion charge. No other city ever dared do that until I did. And although all these other mayors talked to me about it, I can't remember any of them that ever dared to do it. They all thought bringing in a congestion charge, voters would be angry and they'd vote you out of office.
What has a congestion charge done here in London?
Pardon?
What has the congestion charge achieved in London?
Well, the moment I introduced the congestion charge, the number of cars coming into central London went down by 12%. So suddenly traffic was moving better on the streets, buses were getting around quicker, and of course pollution was down 12%. And air pollution kills thousands of Londoners every year. And that death toll went down during my time at the GLC and my time as mayor.
Were there any challenges to public transport, improving public transport, comfort, sound levels? Was that a challenge back in the day?
What?
Improving public transport, was that a challenge at the time? Because some of those trains are quite old and the tracks,
Part of the problem was that previous governments had neglected investment in public transport. From the moment I came into office, I massively increased spending by millions and millions of pounds, built new lines, got new trains and buses. I mean, when I became mayor, we had 6,000 old buses. I bought 8,000 new ones, cut the fares, and the number of people on the buses doubled. And literally, people were driving a car because it was too expensive to get on the bus or the tube. Once I cut the fares, 12% stopped driving into London and got back on public transport.
Right. Tell us about the moment you were selected to become Mayor of London. Do you remember the moment?
Well, the interesting, when Tony Blair created the post of Mayor of London, he was determined I shouldn't get it. And they promoted poor old Frank Dobson, who'd been an old friend of mine. We were locked in this conflict. But then the Labour government rigged the ballot. Although I got more votes, it was always announced that I hadn't. And so I then had to run as an independent. And I couldn't walk down the street without people stopping me and saying, you've got to run for mayor, you've got to run for mayor. And people saw all the rigging that had gone on. They were angry about it.
Is this something, was there evidence that there was rigging?
Well, I haven't ever seen any evidence because the Labour government wouldn't be releasing the fact that they were ballot rigging. But it was obvious that they were. And I remember Frank Dobson telling me he was so ashamed with what the Labour government was doing to get him elected. He was quite miserable about it.
But then eventually you got into the post.
You've got to talk louder.
You became an independent. How did that feel?
Well, it was wonderful because, as I say, I couldn't walk down the street without people asking me to stand. And I knew I was going to win. There's this massive support out there. Because a lot of those people remember what I'd achieved when I'd been the leader of the Greater London Council. And they thought, he can make London better. And of course I did. But, you know, then of course 8 years later I lost to Boris Johnson and he ended almost all my policies.
Was there a reason for that? There was a lot of black PR around that time.
The defining thing about Boris is he's not really a politician. He wants to be a famous global celebrity. And he virtually, in the 8 years he was mayor of London, he did virtually nothing. The only thing he did, he built the cable car to nowhere, which is still empty today. A project we all knew wasn't going to work. It was just bizarre. Boris never got on top of detail. He never read the briefings his staff made for him. He just wants to perform, make people laugh, and be this famous global celebrity.
Well, in a way, he achieved that.
Oh, of course he has. But then, of course, now he's facing criminal trials. I'm
Right.
glad to say.
Back in the day, as you were a mayor of London, what can you describe your daily workflow?
Well, I'd get in about 8:30, and all my wonderful staff were all there. Everything's all ready. I just had to make decisions all day, read reports and so on. It was an absolutely wonderful job. I was lucky. All my staff were brilliant. I mean, they really, without them, I wouldn't have been able to achieve all that I was able to achieve.
How were they brilliant?
Pardon?
How was your staff brilliant?
How?
How was your staff brilliant?
Bread?
Brilliant.
I mean, all my staff, unlike me, had all been to university, got degrees, had already done really interesting jobs. They came with real skills and ability.
How did that help you?
Well, having those staff was brilliant. I would never have been able to achieve all we did in those 8 years as mayor if they hadn't all flourished in to help me do all this work.
Can you give us an example of how they helped you? One policy, or one.
Well, they did the work. So they would. I'd turn up, and on my desk there'd be these reports spanning. You can do this or that. We recommend this. They were always right, and so I.
That's okay. You can get it.
Ken Livingstone? You're what? I can't hear where you're calling from. Oh, yes. Pardon? Can you talk louder? Only if you talk louder. Oh, yeah. Can you send me a letter or an email? Okay. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Let's get a bit closer this time. Okay, fantastic. Right. How would you decide what policy to take up when you were mayor of London?
Well, I didn't come into politics until I was, most people come into politics now, just left union, they get involved. I spent that wonderful 8 years working at the Royal Marsden's Cancer Research Unit. So all my approach to things was you need to get on top of the detail, find out the facts, and then do the right thing. You can't really say that about the political culture we've got in Britain today. So I never did a policy that hadn't been tested. Was it going to work? What could be the problems? Nowadays, it's all just about getting onto the television and doing an interview.
If you were mayor of London today, what would you change?
Well, I think the current mayor is doing quite, dramatically better than Boris Johnson's 8 years as mayor. The trouble is, I was able to get millions of pounds out of Tony Blair's government. Of course, he can't get millions of pounds out of this ghastly Tory government we got today. So he's not able to do as much as he would like. But he's doing well, and I'm going to vote for him again next year.
What about the crime levels today? Is that something that...
Well, the crime level has risen in my lifetime, and I think that's because that culture I grew up in, where every boy and girl left school and got a job, that's no longer there. And a lot of the jobs people have got are insecure or not well paid. And so a lot of people are turning to crime. I never met anyone of my generation that ended up doing something like that.
Right. Of course, there were some famous criminals like the Cray brothers back in the day and others, but these...
You've got to talk louder.
Oh, sorry. There were famous criminals like the Cray brothers.
Yeah.
Did you ever meet them?
I can't ever recall meeting a criminal. No, I did occasionally do tours of prisons, so I might have bumped into some of them there. And yeah, no, literally, there was so much less crime in that world I grew up in. I really worry about it now. And as I've said already, I really worry what the world's going to be like for my kids in 20 years. Crime is going up, the murder rate's going up, rape rate's going up. It's awful. We're living in a world where things are getting worse, not better.
How would you change that? How can it be improved?
Well, the way to change that is to elect a good Labour government under Keir Starmer who'll improve public spending, make our lives better, and get people away from criminality.
Around the world, has that worked? Can you cite examples where things are going well?
I can't cite any examples of what's happening around the world because from the moment I was accused of being anti-Semitic 7 years ago, all my work was cancelled. And this last 7 years, I've just been this old pensioner stuck at home. And no one's ever in touch with me or anything. I don't know I only know what I see on the news.
You said your work was cancelled 7 years ago. How come 7 years ago? What happened?
Well, 7 years ago, the MP, John Mann, arranged a television crew to film him shouting in my face that I was a Nazi apologist, then launched this big lie and said Hitler was a Zionist. And then the General Secretary of the Labour Party announces I'm suspended without having picked up the phone to ask had I said this. But of course, we now know this was nothing to do with 1997. It's about getting rid of the then Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. And all his key supporters like me were being kicked out of the party because finally the Labour Party had a genuinely socialist leader. And the establishment was terrified that if Jeremy became Prime Minister, his Chancellor, John McDonnell, will crack down on all the tax dodging and money laundering of the super rich and make them pay their fair share. Still today, the richest in Britain pay virtually no tax, often none whatsoever.
I see. But, you know, one incident, was that enough to ruin your career?
I don't understand the question.
Was one incident, why did that one incident change things?
What incident?
John Mann, the John Mann interview. Well, I mean, it wasn't really an interview, he was shouting, right? He was accusing. I
mean, John Mann, of course, isn't in the Labour Party anymore. He's been appointed to the House of Lords by the Tories as a reward for all the damage he did to the Labour Party. Because in those days, someone like Mann was terrified of a genuine left-wing government coming to power, and they did everything possible to undermine the then leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and his allies like me were all getting all these lies and smears.
Is it also something to do with maybe Jeremy Corbyn's stance on Ireland and the Middle East, Israel, Palestine? Yeah. Was it all connected, do you think?
I think Jeremy and me, we've both had to put up with so many lies and smears because we've always argued for a united Ireland. We've always wanted a proper deal so the Palestinians get their proper rights in the Middle East. And anyone who ever criticises the policies of the Israeli government is denounced as anti-Semitic. And you just have to put up with that. But Jeremy and me, we've spent all our lives saying what we believe and trying to make life better for people.
So you were on the same page, policy-wise? What was it like when you were Mayor of London?
Well, he was out of office when I was Mayor of London. And under the Labour leader, Tony Blair, he was just left on the backbenches. He was never given a job. Same with under Neil Kinnock. I mean, when I was elected as an MP, me and Jeremy Corbyn would sit on the backbenches. No Labour leader would ever give us a role because we were genuine socialists.
But you were supported, right, by the constituents?
Pardon?
You were supported by the constituents.
Well, not just... I was supported by my constituents like Jeremy was because we did the job. We made life better for our constituents. We took up their issues. I helped them get homes, helped sort out schools that were failing and things like that.
What did you love about the job of Mayor of London?
I love being the Mayor of London because it is a wonderful city, and cities from all around the world wanted help from London about what to do to tackle their problems. They all saw London as having been successful. And I ended up giving advice to so many mayors, I just can't remember how many, about what to do in their cities.
What about the economic situation and financial situation? Were there a lot of corporate lobbies? Did you make life easier for people to invest in the city?
I did everything possible to attract investment. And the key to that is you do public sector investment to make it a better city with better infrastructure. Then more private sector investors will come in. And we did get lots more new jobs created by firms investing and expanding their existing industries, companies.
What about your pastimes? What do you enjoy doing? Your pastimes. Did you have time for socialising when you were Mayor of London?
Being mayor was a very busy job. There was not much time for socialising. Right. Sometimes at the weekend I'd meet up with old friends. We'd go out for a meal or just round to the local pub or something. But no, the job of mayor was pretty massive. You didn't have a lot of time for going out socialising.
I understand that there was an issue with regards to your support of Ireland, and it was resolved. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I just grew up in that post-war world where there was all this violence going on in Northern Ireland. British troops, you could see on the news, British troops shooting protesters dead and things like that. And so I realised you've got to end this. What we need to see is a united Ireland, Catholic and Protestant living together in peace. But there had been so much violence stirred up in Northern Ireland all through the world I was growing up in. And you would see it on the television night after night. Now things have got dramatically better. And that is down to Tony Blair. Within a year of becoming the Prime Minister, he managed to do a deal with the IRA, Jerry Adams. And now we've a peaceful situation there. And the tragedy is that deal could have been done 15 years earlier, but of course the Thatcher government wouldn't ever consider talking to the IRA.
So that's the Good Friday Agreement, where eventually there'll be a vote as to whether to unite or not. Have you ever been to Northern Ireland? Well, obviously you have. What is it different?
Well, I was flown out to Northern Ireland at the invitation of the IRA in 1982, and of course the Tory media went mad. And I was struck by how impoverished the Catholic areas were. It was like going back to the 1950s. The homes were in a terrible state. Now, under Tony Blair's Labour government and Gordon Brown's, things have dramatically got better, thank God.
Was there a threat to your life because of some of your policies?
Was there
a threat to your life because of some
effect?
A threat? Was there a threat to your life because of some of your policies and?
Well, I came within 24 hours of being shot in the head back in the 1990s. I was an MP then, and I was making speeches urging a united Ireland. And Northern Ireland's Protestant terrorist group decided to kill me. They sent one of their assassins. He monitored me for 2 days. They decided they would shoot me in the head just as I went into work in the morning, as I went into the tube station. But fortunately, MI5 had an undercover agent in their leadership, and he talked them out of it. And what annoys me so much is when I became mayor and I had a meeting with the head of MI5, I said, I want to take that guy out for dinner. He saved my life. She would never give me his name. I have no idea why.
What about Israel? Have you ever been to Israel, Gaza, West Bank?
Well, I was first flown out to Israel in 1986, I think, shortly after the GLC was abolished by Thatcher. And I was taken on a tour by the then opposition Israeli Labour Party, and we all got on fine. I loved it. I mean, if someone said to me, you've got to spend the rest of your life living in the Middle East, I'd be straight off to Israel.
Why?
It's a much better, well, it's a genuine democracy, and it's a much better state than all the other nations around it.
Were you invited to the Arab countries when you were mayor?
I mean, I've been all over the world, but I'm an old man now and I can't remember. I can't remember which ones I went to, sorry.
No problem.
I've done so many visits around the world, it all blurs.
I see. What about these days? Do you read books? Do you listen to music? Are there any major pastimes you have today now?
7 years ago when I was being anti-Semitic, all my work was cancelled. So this last 7 years, I've just been this old pensioner stuck at home. But I enjoy reading books, I enjoy watching the news on telly, and then every afternoon I go around to the local pub and have a nice chat with other old men. My wife doesn't get home till 6:30, but I'm always back there in time for her, making sure she gets a good meal.
What's your relationship like with your wife?
We got together about 22 years ago. She's given me 2 wonderful kids, but she's 21 years younger than me, so that age gap now, she's physically a lot better off than I am.
Right. And I'm wondering, yes, I see here that the Russian Winter Festival in Trafalgar Square. When was the first time you visited Russia or the Soviet Union or the USSR?
I was first invited out to Russia during Gorbachev's leadership, and so I was happy to go then. Gorbachev was a good Russian leader. You can't say that about many of the others that we've had. We've got to have a good working relationship with Russia, just as we have to with China. We're in a global world. We need good relationships, good and more trade, because that helps create jobs, both for them and for us.
Do you remember your impression of Russia when you visited?
I can't, I'm afraid. It's a very long time ago. And also, I was broadly just meeting up with politicians. I don't think I was getting much access to the general, ordinary life there.
Right. What would you talk about with politicians when you're traveling to China or Soviet Union or other parts of the world?
These politicians almost always wanted to talk to me about the congestion charge, because they were considering whether they should do it in their cities, or the other things I was doing, like building more council homes and getting more police on the streets. Because when I became mayor, there were 25,000 police in London. I got it up to 35. But I did the big change. I brought back street patrols. Immediately, crime went down by a quarter. And then, of course, Boris got in and abolished that. Now crime's back up again.
Whose idea was it to bring back street patrols?
That was my idea, because... Do I need to put the question in?
Yeah, sure.
It was my idea to bring back police street patrols, because that was the post-war world I grew up in, and you were safe. As you walk down the street, you pass a police officer. Now, you almost never see a police officer on the street. Of course, crime has gone up.
Do you think technology has a lot to do with the way things have changed?
Pardon?
Do you think technology has a lot to do with the way things have changed?
I've no idea. I don't do any. I've never been on the internet once.
I see.
No. Well, when I was mayor, my staff were dealing with that. I never did. And, I just like reading books and watching the telly.
What books do you read?
Usually what I'm reading is history and politics. I never do dramas I'm just interested in facts.
What history books? And would you like to show us a history book or that you're reading?
Well, I'm currently reading the largest book I've ever had in my life, The History of Palestine. And it's quite shocking because it records the details of all the murders, the violence that took place in there.
And, right. And so what next? What are your plans for the future?
I have no plans for the future. I'm 78. The average life in Britain is 80. So I could be dead in my sleep tonight. I'm hoping I'll still be here chatting to people like you in another 10 years though.
That's interesting. Would you like to show us some photos or memorabilia of things that you're proud of? Or
it's me having a pint.
Oh, who drew it?
What?
Who drew this?
I can't remember. Can I get up and take all this off?
Yes, absolutely. I think we're good. Thank you. Let me just take a picture of that. That's fantastic.
And there's some nice pictures here of my weddings.
Oh, yes, please, if that's okay.
And there's this old one of me when I was elected to the GLC. I wish I still looked like that.
Oh, wow. Really, that's you? That's unbelievable. You look
private. I had only been. It's at 81. I've been leader of the GLC for about 2 months.
extremely.
So I'm only 36 then.
Well, you look very photogenic. You remind me of some of the characters I see in these films. Okay. I'm just going to get a close-up here. This podcast is sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Thank you for listening to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Should you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please get in touch.